Now let's change our focus to looking at how we can modulate MIDI devices like the Elektron Digitone instead of modular. And I chose the Digitone because I love it as a synthesizer, but also because it has a lot of very easily modulated parameters using MIDI, which have dramatic changes on the sound, and indeed we can see them animated here on the screen. So it's a great way to demonstrate modulation lanes and also LFOs on the Oxi One. I've created a new project and I've set up 4 different voices on 4 different tracks here on the Digitone, and I've got each of the sequencers now sequencing those voices. Now let's take a look at sequencer 3, which is this bass sound. I want to use the LFO here to do modulation, and so for this we're going to hit the LFO and we come to LFO 1 for sequencer 3. And what I want to modulate is the envelope depth here of the filter to create a different squelchy kind of bass sound. So we're going to modulate that. So what I want to do is press Shift and this knob here to choose the MIDI destination for that modulation amount. It's CC 25 for the envelope depth. Okay, that's there. And we'll just set it to modulate over 1 bar. Now it's a triangle wave, so we should see this indicator here, the envelope depth indicator on the Digitone, move back and forth and back and forth. Oh boy, look at that, it's gone all the way to 0 and then come back up. Now what's that showing us? That's showing us that even though we're modulating by, say, the amount is now 20, the envelope depth is offsetting from a negative amount, or 0 in this case. So if I just press Shift on the knob, I can now add an offset to offset that CC. I'm going to offset it back up to the midpoint by offsetting by 64. And now we see, look at this. We're creating the right amount of modulation, but it's still only in the positive direction. So I'll just go back a bit there. Increase the amount of modulation so I get it across the full range I want. Now, we can see that we've created an offset and set the range, and the modulation is happening on the envelope across a bar. Probably a little bit too fast. I'm going to change that to say 3 bars. Let's go ahead and bring in sequencer 1, which is that chord progression. Now let's look at some parameters we can modulate using the mod lanes on the chord progression. Now I've opened up the mod lane for sequencer 1, which is our chord sequencer, and we just press mod, and I'm going to shift press the knob here for mod lane 1 so we can choose the mod destination. Now we can always send MIDI modulation out in addition to internal modulation, but what I want to focus on for this piece is just modulating an internal parameter. And in this case, I'm going to scroll down the list to chord type. Now, it's going to be very extreme, but we're going to do a very slight amount of modulation to see how it affects the sound. So let's just turn that on, and we press play, and as I start turning this, you'll hear the voicing or the type of the chord has changed. Now, this suggests something to me. If I slowly step through different modulation values here, I can completely change how that sequence is playing without ever changing the bass chord. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to slow it all the way down to 1 bar. So now my modulation will take a lot longer to play through. I'm also going to reduce the amount of modulation because I don't need it to be quite so extreme. So now let's take a listen to how this sounds when I play the chord progression we've heard before, but this time with the modulation offsetting the chording type. And it's 4 steps because each step here corresponds to 1 bar and the chord progression is over 4 bars. So 4 bars, 4 bars, 4 bars, 4 bars. So we start off with the same chords that we're used to hearing because we haven't offset, this is set to 0. Now we'll hear a change in the chord type. Here it's a different type there. Same progression, different chord type. And again a different chord type. Now, I'm not going to claim these are super musical, but the idea here is that by applying modulation at a much slower rate than the actual sequencer is playing, you can dramatically change what the sequencer is playing. Your modulation lanes can be up to 128 steps long, and at one bar, that's 128 bars of different modulation that can be applied. So you've got quite a lot of power here in terms of making your music evolve and change. You're not just stuck into a 128-step grid. Now, the next thing I want to show you is on sequencer 2, and that's where I have the arpeggiator set up to arpeggiate the notes of the chord. I use the pick and place feature to set the chord progression in sequencer 1. I copy that into sequencer 2, and then I turned on the arpeggiator, which defaults into chord mode. And that now lets you arpeggiate the notes of the chords, which is actually a lovely, lovely thing to play along with. Because I've harmonized sequencer 2 to sequencer 1, as the chord progression changes, including with the modulation in sequencer 1, the arpeggios will also change. One of the things we can do is use our LFOs to modulate an internal destination. And I'm going to turn the knob down here to the very bottom, and we'll see chord arp type, octave, and division, and I'm going to modulate the chord arp octave, and that's the octave range, and we can just modulate that by, say, a small amount over a bar. And we could slow down the rate of the ramp as well, and that would allow us to actually hear the arpeggio a little bit better.